My name is Nicole Lamerson, and I am a research associate at Brandeis University at the Lurie Institute for Disability Policy at the National Research Center for Parents with Disabilities. And welcome to our webinar today, Strategies for Supporting Parents with Disabilities when there is Child Welfare Involvement. I'm just going to go through a few housekeeping slides, and then I'm going to turn it over to our panelists. Each panelist will talk for about 20 minutes, and then we'll hopefully have 10 minutes at the end for questions. If you could put your questions in the Q&A box rather than chat, that would really be helpful for the folks who are monitoring the questions and answers. Next slide, please. For closed captioning and ASL, we are currently doing live captioning. And if you need ASL, you can click on the More button at the bottom of your screen on the far right-hand side and click Interpretation. If you have any problems with seeing either ASL or captioning, please direct message me or Madeline Crowley, who is on this call also from Lurie, and we'll try to help you out. Next slide. Just a quick housekeeping note about our funding. The contents of this presentation were developed under a grant from the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research. NIDLR is a center within the Administration for Community Living under the auspices of the Department of Health and Human Services. However, it's important to note that the content of this presentation contains the views solely of the author and are not representative of the views of our funder. Next slide. These are resources that I generally share with every presentation. We will be sending out slides that are accessible to screen readers with the recording of this presentation when it goes out, and all of these resources will be in that slide deck for you. And with that, I am going to turn it over to our first panelist, Liz Lightfoot.
Hi, everybody. I'm waiting for it to get going here. Whoops. So I can start without the slides showing up. So am I supposed to share them myself, or were you sharing them?
One moment, I'll share them.
Oh, okay. I am so super happy to be here and doing this webinar with Dr. Kara Ayers. And I'm going to be doing the first part, and my part, I'm essentially going to be setting up the second part where we're going to be talking about a case study. So I was going to show you the agenda. Should I do it?
Sorry, it starts sharing and then it says pause.
Okay. Well, I'll introduce myself while you're working on it. So my name's Liz Lightfoot, and I am a professor, and I'm the director of the School of Social Work at Arizona State University. And I have been doing research, particularly on the intersection of parents with disabilities in the child welfare system for about 15 years. So this is a topic that's very important to me, and I do I think I should share it. So I'm like sitting here watching. You want me to go ahead and share my own screen?
Sure, thank you.
Okay, hold on a second here. Sorry about the technical difficulties. Okay, share. Can you see it? Okay. Slideshow. Okay, so what I'm going to be talking about, as I said, I'm sort of setting up Dr. Ayers for her section. I'm going to be doing a little bit of the background and some concepts and give you access to some different resources than the ones that were presented before for when you yourself are encountering child protection workers, or if you're supporting somebody who is. And I am a co-investigator of the National Research Center for Parents with Disabilities. I also have a small grant from the Arizona Developmental Disabilities Planning Council, which has 3 separate projects just in the state of Arizona working on providing better services and supports for parents with disabilities. So I'm super proud to be at Arizona State University in Arizona while we're doing this. So the little background I want to provide you first is that parents with disabilities, well, the big issue right now is their intersection with the child protection system. Parents with disabilities, all types of disabilities, have been experiencing discrimination and oppression for centuries. And it was been particularly bad in the 20th century, when in the US, people with disabilities were routinely sterilized involuntarily without their consent. And this practice was not an informal practice. This was formalized into state law. So the first state that passed a law allowing involuntary sterilization of parents with disabilities was Indiana in 1910 or 1907. And then a number of states followed suit. And this led to a point where we had dozens of states that had state laws allowing for involuntary sterilization. And it led to a Supreme Court case when in Virginia, they similarly passed a law. So the case that was used was the case of the young woman on the left named Carrie Buck, and the state and the state or the federal Supreme Court case was Buck versus Bell. And that's a photo of her on the left with her mother on the right. And the Supreme Court ruled that it was constitutional. It was okay to involuntarily sterilize people with disabilities. And they used horrible language like the unfit. And Oliver Wendell Holmes, who's a very famous, often well-liked Supreme Court justice, wrote that the public interest outweighed the interest of the individuals in their own bodily integrity. And in the decade that followed, thousands and thousands of people with disabilities, mostly women, but also men, were involuntarily sterilized against their will. And this practice kind of withered out around the time of just after World War II, but it sort of has morphed into this different situation, which is the common practice of removing babies at birth from mothers with disabilities, or removing kids from mothers and fathers with disabilities as they get older by the child protection system. And this is still happening today. And this is what we're here talking about today. So next slide, please. Oh, no, I'm doing slides. I'm telling myself that. Okay, so when I'm doing research, some of the like to know sort of the background here of what's going on. And so obviously we know that lots of people with disabilities have kids, and we're finally just trying to figure out how many there are, but we know that at least a tenth of parents in general have some type of disability. We also know, and this is the research that I've been doing, is that parents with disabilities are much more likely to be reported for child abuse and neglect, so by mandated reporters or others. Once it's reported, to have abuse substantiated. So that means that the child protection system says, yes, abuse occurred. That doesn't necessarily mean that abuse did occur, but it's saying that it's been substantiated. For parents with disabilities are much more likely to have their children placed in foster care or other out-of-home care. And they're much more likely to have their parental rights terminated. And this is for, I usually do cross-disability research, but we've seen that for people with all different types of disability labels, that they're more likely to be reported, have abuse substantiated, have their children placed in foster care, and have their rights terminated. And I won't go into all the reasons why this might be, but some of it is just general discriminatory attitudes and stigma. Some of it is, for the reporting, is this idea of the exposure hypothesis, which means that people with some types of disabilities have people in their house or in their lives more often who are mandated reporters, so they're more likely to get reported. And then there's also this whole state and federal policy context that affects it too. Another reason is that we know that child protection workers get little training on supporting parents with disabilities. Social workers in general do, and child protection workers in particular do. And the project I'm working on with the National Center right now is we're actually developing a training for child protection workers that we're going to roll out in the state of Arizona and then make it available to child protection systems nationwide. So that's forthcoming, but I'm really excited about that because there really isn't very much. We also know that there's very few services and supports for parents with disabilities. There are, dozens of services across the country. So there's not often good places for parents with disabilities to get help in caring for their children. So I'm saying all of this where we also have our research is showing that parents with disabilities are not more likely to abuse or neglect their kids. So all of this is happening within this environment where we know that parents with disabilities are not more likely to abuse or neglect their kids on average, but they're much more likely to get involved in the child protection system. So I talked a little bit about the policies, and these policies actually set a big context for it. And it's important when you're supporting parents with disabilities, or you are a parent with a disability, to understand what's going on in your own state and to know what's going on nationally. So how child protection works is each state has their own child protection laws. So there is a little bit of guidance from the federal government, but these are state laws. And this is actually how I got most interested in this topic, and what really sparked my passion is I happened to be sort of digging around for some other reason and was looking at state statutes. And I was shocked to find how many states had parental disability as a grounds for termination of parental rights. And this is an example from Arizona's. And this is, you don't have to read the whole thing, but essentially these are the grounds for termination of parental rights. So what are the reasons we can terminate parental right in the state? And one of them, number 3, is that the parent is unable to discharge parental responsibilities because of mental illness, mental deficiency, which is using old language that we don't use and it's undefined. And then this one goes on to talk about drugs and alcohol. And this kind of language was in, when I was doing this, then I went down the rabbit hole and found that 37 states had very similar language that focused on things like mental deficiency as grounds for termination of parental rights. This doesn't happen, this isn't in every state, and they certainly are removing kids in states that don't have these laws, but this sort of policy context really gave child protection agencies this direction to remove kids. This actually, I did this research, and that's the National Council on Disability then wrote the Rocking the Cradle report a few years later, where they, based it on this research we've done. And there have been some states that have removed this language from their state statutes. Say another thing about states is to know that your parents' rights differ by state. And so what parents can do when they're interacting with the child protection system is also very state-based, and it's important. So this is important to know what this is. This is some examples. This isn't everything, but examples of what are parents' rights just in Arizona, such as you can deny entry into your home, or you can have an attorney present, or you have the right to respond to allegations and have the Child Protection Agency or the courts consider this. You have the right, if their child is placed out of home, to maintain contact with your child. So these sorts of things. So this is something to look at to see what's going on in your state. Okay, so I said that there have been some changes to state statutes. We've also had some stuff at the national level go on, such as in 2015, Department of Justice. I won't go into the details of this, so you can look it up. But the Department of Justice investigated a really egregious case in Massachusetts where a baby had been removed from a mother in the hospital without because she was having some hesitations in caring for her kid. And they failed to take into consideration that she was planning on going home and living in her mother's house, so with the grandmother there, and the kid was gone for a long time. So they released this guidance, and we now all know more about guidances since our new federal administration is releasing a number of these guidances. But this guidance is said that child protection services cannot discriminate against parents with disabilities, and in all aspects of child protection. It also said, and really importantly, is that child welfare agencies have to look individualized treatment. So they can't say, oh, this person with this type of disability needs this type of services. No, it has to be on what the individual need of a parent with a disability is. So it can't be based on generalization. So this was great. It's our first federal guidance was in 2015. And actually just last year, in the new regulations for the Rehabilitation Act 504, they actually released in regulations the same sort of language that parents with disabilities, we can't discriminate against parents with disabilities when they're involved in the child protection system. So I've got links to this at the end of my presentation as well. So it's been going in the right direction, but that doesn't mean that this has trickled down to child protection agencies. And Department of Justice most recent finding was just this last December in my state of Arizona, where they found that Arizona, they call it the Department of Child Safety in Arizona, discriminates against parents with disabilities, kids with disabilities too. They based this on investigations actually done a couple of years ago. So they didn't know that we were already working on some of the recommendations already. So I was telling you that we're going to be doing training, developing a training for all child protection workers, and that's one of their recommendations. So I feel like we're already, responding to this already. But this is something that DOJ is going around, or it had been. I don't know what's going to happen now, but it had been, looking and investigating to see what's happening in the various states. And some states are having to make big adjustments here, which is a great step forward. Okay. When I do trainings, I usually do this for much longer. So I'm just going to give you a few more pieces before I turn it over to Dr. Ayers. But when I've been developing this training, I've brought together expert groups of parents with disabilities and people who serve parents with disabilities and some thought leaders, and said, what do you wish people knew when helping parents with disabilities who are involved in the child protection system? And these are a couple of areas, and there's more, but these are just a few that I'll talk about that I think are important. So the first one is this concept of parental supports. And the whole disability service system is set up around the idea of individual supports. We provide supports for individuals to do what it's called normative life activities, like going to work or going to school or going to the community. And we haven't developed a system that includes supports for parenting. So we don't actually have a good funding structure for funding supports for parents with disabilities. Now, some people have worked around this different ways, which is great. But like in general, right now, it's very difficult to get public support to help you take care of your kid. You can get help take care of yourself, but not take care of your kid or support your kid. And so one of the things that folks were telling me, and that what we've been finding in our own research, is that we really sort of need to expand this concept of supports to be more than just supporting individuals, but supporting parents and families and family connections, and thinking of that as a regular activity for all people, including people with disabilities. The second is really a very child protection specific. So we talk a lot about risk factors in child protection. And there's numerous risk factors that have been associated with child abuse and neglect, such as young parents. But we know when we have these risk factors for other groups, such as young parents, we sort of know that that doesn't mean that every young parent is abusing or neglecting their kid. But parents with disabilities often are at a higher level of scrutiny, and also at there's stereotypes made that, oh, there's a risk factor, so that equals child endangerment, or that means that a parent with disability is going to endanger their child or abuse or neglect their child, when we know that most parents with disabilities do not. And so really sort of breaking this link between what's a risk factor and what's actually happens in the real world is really important. The sort of similar one is this good enough parenting standard. I know most parents want to be good parents. Maybe they want the best for their kids. But when child protection agencies are assessing capacity, often they're holding parents with disabilities to this higher standard, not this good enough parenting standard. So it's not usually we're looking, are they going to, are they abusing or neglecting their kid? Not, are they a perfect parent? And so this standard has been held where we're holding them to a higher standard. And we need to be sure that when parents with disabilities get involved in the child protection system, they should be able to demonstrate how they can be good enough parents with appropriate supports like other folks. And then probably the most important one is what we call the presumption of unfitness bias. And that is the widespread biases against parents with disabilities about their unfitness to parent. And the nature of this bias differs based on, different types of parental disabilities, but it's the general idea that maybe professionals or people in the community or people's families think, oh, they're not fit to be a parent. And that sort of goes back to this language we've had for centuries about fitness. And this bias can lead to parents with disabilities being referred more often to the child protection system. It can lead to decisions made in the child protection system, including losing their kids. And it also, because so many people are aware of this, parents with disabilities, of course, they know this, that there's these stigmas against them, that they're more likely to withdraw from services because they're worried about who's going to refer them to the child protection system. And so we've seen this a lot, that actually people will withdraw from supportive services because they're worried about who's going to report them to child protection, and they're going to lose the kids. So this presumption of unfitness bias can't be overstated. I'll just say two more things before I turn it over to Dr. Ayers. First, when if a parent with a disability gets involved in the child protection system, there is some evidence, we use evidence when we're talking about services, about different interventions that child protection could refer parents to that works, which means that it helps parents with disabilities. And we can go into these later, but there's all sorts of them. A lot of them focus on parenting skills, and a lot of them are focused on folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities, but there's a lot of skills training that's evidence-based. So this is something when a child protection agency says we don't know what to do, well, then they can fund parenting skills interventions. That's something they can do. There's also social support interventions, such as, peer support groups that Dr. Ayers will talk about later. There's also structured support groups, and there's all sorts of different things like peer navigators, court interpreters, all sorts of interventions that can help people navigate in the social world. So there is evidence that can be used in court cases, for example, related to parents with disabilities. And then I'm gonna turn it over to Dr. Ayers now, but I want to say that there's also, I'm going to give you a link to a guide that I made for working with parents with disabilities. It's really pretty user-friendly and accessible, but it includes all sorts of sort of tips on working with parents with disabilities for social workers, particularly because I'm in a social work, to help provide better supports for people, particularly when they're involved in the child welfare system. And that's this user-friendly guide here, and you'll get this in a link, and also more details about the new 504 law. So I'm hoping this sort of background set up Dr. Ayers for sort of the heart of this workshop, which is talking about a case study and then more specific strategies. So thank you very much. And if anyone wants to reach out to me afterwards, I'm happy to talk to folks and do expert testimony and other sorts of things. So I will stop sharing now and turn it back.
Thank you, Dr. Lightfoot. I am going to share my screen as well. All right, I think you can see it now. Okay, I'm Dr. Kara Ayers, and so as Dr. Lightfoot mentioned, I'm going to be discussing a case study as part of my portion of today's webinar. But first, I also wanted to share a little bit about myself. I am a disabled parent along with my husband, who is also a disabled parent. I think Dr. Lightfoot already mentioned or had on her slides the connection that both of us have to the National Research Center for Parents with Disabilities, who's hosting this webinar. I'm also connected to the National Center for Disability and Pregnancy Research, and I'm trained as a psychologist and co-founded the Disabled Parenting Project, which really leverages that value of peer-to-peer connections that Dr. Lightfoot mentioned. This is a photo of my family. So my husband and I feel, uh, you know, we think about our own threats to the security of our family as we learn from other parents with disabilities who've had different experiences, including the one I'm going to share today, who had involvement with Child Protective Services. So this is a very hits close to home personal issue for us as well. So I'm going to share a case study of a disabled parent we're going to call Lena, who was reported to Child Protective Services. And I know that it's called different things in different states. We're going to try to use the more general name so that we all know what we're talking about. But Lena was reported to CPS by a nurse. And I've got my slides are a little more text heavy than they usually are. I wanted to make sure that I both got all the details right, but also that you'd have them after the fact if you wanted to kind of look back and see the many places that I wish someone would have stepped in and said, wait a minute, this isn't quite right to go forth with an investigation. So first off, it's important to know that Lena has a physical disability. She's a wheelchair user. She lives in her own home with her partner and their 2-year-old child. Lena has her graduate degree and she works full time in her field. Her partner also works full time. Between the two of them, they have one day off where they're able to have provide keep the child in the home one day, but 4 days a week, the child goes to another person's home for in-home childcare. Lena requested an evaluation from the state to determine if she was eligible for in-home nursing services. She knew that she had a surgery and that it was going to require some more assistance with wound care, and so she wanted to see if she qualified for these services. So the nurse that conducts this evaluation arrived at her home. Interestingly, the nurse made it a point that she needed to evaluate Lena as quickly after her surgery as possible. So she came to the home only hours after Lena had returned from the hospital where she'd had outpatient surgery that day. So as you can imagine, if you've ever had outpatient surgery, you're still kind of feeling I'm at least feeling a little wonky a few hours later. But Lena's partner, this is an important detail, had taken their child outside the home just to give a little more quiet and space for the evaluation. She is a toddler. So the child was never in the home when the nurse was present. 3 days after the evaluation, Lena received a call from CPS stating that there had been a report of suspected child neglect and that she was asked to schedule an in-home evaluation to take place 5 days later. And this felt very expedited because there was also a weekend in there. So I believe she received the call on like a Thursday or Friday, and they were stating like, we need to schedule this right away, like on a Tuesday or Wednesday. So it was very quick. A CPS worker arrived at the home for the evaluation and conducted a 50-minute interview, inspecting medicine cabinets, refrigerators, pantry, and living spaces. He also requested access to medical records since birth and contact information to interview the family's child care provider. There were a couple things that were different from Lena's case compared to some other parents that I've talked to kind of after the fact. Lena reached out to me immediately upon receiving that first call, and she lives just an hour and a half or so away from me. She was familiar with some of the work that I do, so we were able to kind of cross-check her rights in our state. And so she had invited me to be present for the evaluation, and we were able to double check that it was allowable for it to be recorded as well. So there were a couple times that she kind of looked over at me and invited me to participate in the process. And those included when she was asked for access to the medical records. She wondered whether she had the right to refuse that. And then also she wondered whether she had the right to refuse access to the child care provider since they had a relatively new relationship with this child care provider. It's really hard to find child care for parents with disabilities. Lots of considerations like, can you get in the home to drop off the baby? Also, affordable childcare is a challenge, I think, for all parents right now, or almost all parents. So she was rightfully really nervous about, I'm nervous about the, message this is going to signal that Child Protective Services is going to call my babysitter and say, hey, we're, evaluating Lena and family. So the evaluator asked Lena multiple questions about whether she was alone with her child, as well as, and preface this question with, and just because I'm curious, the person asked, is the child adopted? Followed by, and if you don't mind me asking, how did you have the child? So these are just a couple of examples of questions that were entirely not part of the standardized form and indicated ableism as part of the process. Quick side note, I don't know why that animation is happening. It's not particularly relevant. So um, the last bullet here says that Lena did allow the evaluator to speak to her parents. There were two other contacts, both her mom and her dad, that the evaluator had asked to speak to, but she ended up denying access to the child care provider as was within her rights. And then she also denied access to medical records, also totally within her rights. These are some examples. This slide shares some microaggressions that we've gathered from our research with broader groups of people with disabilities. And you could just see some of these playing out even in this 50-minute evaluation, asking questions that aren't part of the standardized interview, prefacing it with, I'm just curious. That's not a reason to ask someone a personal question. In this case, we didn't have the example of the type of microaggression of helplessness, like frantically helping somebody and treating them like a child. Other examples frequently expressed by disabled parents that they experience are patronization, denial of disability, saying things like, I don't even think of you as having a disability, and sometimes questioning our children. Undoubtedly, that would have happened in this case, but their child is a toddler and not yet old enough to participate in an evaluation like that. So 1 week after the in-home evaluation, Lena received a phone call that her case had been closed and that there would be no permanent record that the investigation had taken place. It was very clear that the evaluator was kind of attempting to be on, his quote best behavior because there was me and advocate present. We had noted several times that we were aware of her legal rights. We were recording the session. So we believe that all of that kind of contributed to a rather expedited closing of this case. And then 2 weeks after the evaluation, she received a final letter in the mail documenting and confirming that decision. Interestingly, she was denied the in-home nursing care, despite when you read criteria, it would seem that she would undoubtedly qualify. She was denied that nursing care, in-home nursing care without explanation, and she is appealing the decision, but still waiting months later for what will come of that. So if you're open to it, just a quick kind of exercise, dropping in the chat, what questions does Lena's story bring up for you? And I can sort of share what questions it brought up for me as you're doing that, but I'm excited to see what I know that this group is going to come up with all kinds of other issues that I haven't thought about, despite being pretty close to this case. So a couple things that it brought up for me is that there are very few kind of checks and balances or standards of reports of child neglect and abuse that are supposed to be met before it's passed on to the next stage. So, from our understanding, there had been at least 3 supervisors who had okayed that this report made sense for further evaluation before Lena got the call. And that left a lot of questions for me because, again, the child was never in the home. So it was impossible for this nurse to observe anything. And the nurse did not make any reports related to the safety or the upkeep of the home itself. So the report has to be based on entirely on assumptions about disability and parenting. And there's no other way kind of to go about it. So that was a looming question for me. It also taught me how difficult it was to clarify our rights. Even though both of us lived in the same state, it would be even more difficult if I was trying to clarify rights in a different state because I had contacts that I could call directly, like our protection and advocacy organization in the state. I had a lawyer who is a contact of mine who works in family court. So even with those contacts, it was extremely difficult to really get a clear picture of what her rights were in terms of what she could deny without repercussions, what she could and couldn't do or say. And it also felt very much like coercion to me at times with the evaluator, who it seemed at one point was definitely very anxious about this particular case because I was present, she was present, and we were both making it clear that we felt this evaluation was unjust. So I felt at times that there was this effort to push Lena into a space where she'd just agree to not be alone with her child. Because at certain points, she shared that due to her physical disability and her child's current developmental period, a toddler, she said, they make it work, she and her partner, where she is almost never alone with a child at this point. So it felt as though that the worker at times was trying to kind of uh, push her into a position where maybe she would enter into a plan where she would agree formally not to be alone with the child. And that had me concerned for various reasons. She had done nothing to lose the capability of determining when and how she's alone with her child. And also, there's likely no end date on that. Who would get to decide when she was allowed to be alone with her own child? So, that was another time that I kind of spoke up, just pointing out that I had concerns that I felt like that was not like an easy fix to this issue because as we saw it, there was no problem. The child was not in any harm, and our our Lena had not done anything wrong. So I think underpinning all of this is hopefully clear to many in this room is the impact of ableism. And there are many different definitions of ableism. I go back to the working definition of T.L. Lewis that reminds us of the connections of ableism to other forms of oppression and also explains why we see an overrepresentation of people of color in child protective services systems as well, not because they are more likely to abuse or neglect their children, just as the same is untrue for parents with disabilities, but because the system itself is wrapping up these families and kind of keeping them under surveillance, and it's not a fair use of power in our system. Another aspect of that definition that I continue to come back to is that you do not have to be disabled to experience ableism. In this case, Lena's child does not have a disability, but the separation of her family would be an intense trauma to her life. And, so it's a very hard-hitting example of why ableism encompasses all of us, whether we have a disability or not, and that we can be victims and harmed by ableism, whether we have a disability or not. I found in this second and final portion before we hear questions from you, and just a quick reminder, go ahead and drop those in the Q&A box if you can. I know they'll be easier to find there than to sort out from our chat box. But I know Nicole's working hard to find them wherever you put them probably, but Q&A box is better. So in preparing for today's talk, I really wanted to have a better understanding. I had a very deep and quick investigation period with Lena as we worked on this together in the state of Ohio. But I wanted to know about other states and how they varied and what were the specific rights that I could tell people when they say, I'm a disabled parent, what are my rights? CPS has reached out to me. And what I found was a lot of variability, which Dr. Lightfoot talked about. But I did find some kind of nuggets that I wanted to pull out from you. So I looked pretty intensely into New York's CPS system, which their acronym is ACS. And I just blanked on what it was, on what ACS is. But for now, we're going to go with New York Child Protective Services. And I found this quote, which is from their own commissioned audit. So they commissioned a group to do a full investigation and report of the way they do business. And from their own audit, this quote emerged. CPS, quote, standards for what constitutes an appropriate level of childcare is set by what white middle class non-disabled families with more economic resources presumably have. Poverty and racial bias are bigger factors than actual safety concerns or abuse. And so, interestingly, and I don't know if it's because there were findings like this, but despite commissioning that report, New York would not release it to the public. So it had to be retained by the Freedom of Information Act request. And then, advocates since then have learned that even their own investigation of their work has shone a light on real disparities within the system. So, other things that I've kind of learned about parental rights when Child Protective Services is involved along the way is that, again, I can't put enough asterisks on this, is that varies state by state, which is part of the huge problem. But depending on your state, disabled parents may have rights that include the right to refuse entry into your home without a court order, the right not to speak to a CPS worker without an attorney present or without a court order, the right to withhold consent for a release of medical records, and the ability to record child welfare interviews. So several of those or two of those at least, the last two we utilized with Lena's case. I think what is unfortunately very manipulative about the way that this work is often done is that if many of us were home and a police officer knocked on our door in full uniform and said, I need to come in. I need to do an investigation. Many of us would think, wait a minute, I have a right to say, no, you can't come in. You have to have a warrant first. Not everybody, but many people would. But when a Child Protective Services worker appears at your doorstep wearing everyday clothes and they say, hey, we've got a complaint. I just need to ask you a few questions. Do you mind if I come in? When you say yes to that, it is really similar to saying yes to a law enforcement officer on your porch in uniform asking you to come in. So I encourage people to just take a pause and remember that you do have rights. I know it's very scary because there's this concern of if I don't comply automatically or immediately, I'm going to face repercussions or retaliation. And people may not be friendly when you say, you know what? No, not before I speak to my attorney or not without a court order. So people may push back when you assert your rights, but I want people to be aware that many times there are more rights than they're aware of. These are broadly called family Miranda laws, which Texas has passed. New York has attempted to pass a few times, but hasn't. This is one of the protest events where they were trying to get this passed. And I thought this poster she's holding had an astounding stat in that 56,400 homes were searched, and the department only had a court order 94 times. So that's enormous, right? And I thought this was really fascinating too. So these bills that are kind of popping up across the country are not actually new rights at all. So this is a quote from the Texas Public Policy Foundation. And interestingly, this is a very bipartisan, nonpartisan issue. You have people from both parties kind of advocating for and against. And so it's interesting. But this quote says, these aren't really new rights created. These are rights that families already have had. It's a matter of taking the extra step to notify them. So the system has definitely profited on the fact that people don't know that they have a right to say, well, let's slow down. No, you can't come in right now. Here's my number. Call me and we'll discuss this further. So you often have more rights than you know. And it feels like to me that it is at least somewhat intentionally difficult to find your rights clearly. And some people are working to change that with the family Miranda laws. I wanted to end with just some areas for ongoing advocacy for parents who are targeted by Child Protective Services. What's often identified as one of the largest kind of power factors that allows this to keep happening is the myth of benevolence. And so the myth that the system is helping children in need, the system takes away children only from parents who are unfit, and that the system is going to put children in foster homes that are loving and safe environments. And this is just not always or even mostly true. We need to counter this myth by understanding that there is significant harm in separating families. We also need to understand that a caseworker's lack of awareness of disabled parenting is not the same as a safety concern. Mandated reporters are not mandated to report their hypothetical worries based on their ignorance about disability. It is their responsibility to be aware and informed of the multitude of ways that families under their case management services work and live and go about their day-to-day lives. It is not the same as a safety concern if a person has a disability. And last, curiosity, is fine for your off time if you're a caseworker. I hope caseworkers, delve into lots of things they're curious about, as I hope all of us do. But when you're on the clock, it is not appropriate to act out your curiosities by finding out more about people with inappropriate questions that are not part of a standardized review process. I also have dug more deeply into enhancing data protections as part of this support for disabled parents. So one of the things that we see is so much data is collected from parents who are caught up in the system. And unfortunately, it's also being used in what we call predictive ways to guess who's at most risk for abusing and neglecting their children. And some of the variables that they're using to guess are directly targeting parents with disabilities. So for example, one system used how many hospital visits the parent was having to seek health care for their own health. And they were attributing that to greater risk factor for abuse or neglect. And so obviously for many parents with disabilities and chronic illness, we're going to the doctor more often. We may be going to the hospital more often. That is not predictive of abuse or neglect. So lastly, I found it so interesting that despite the way the system captures lots and lots of data, when parents and communities want some of their own data back to document their case, it is extremely difficult. So that's one step that we're going through with Lena right now to find out more about what exactly was in her report, the original report. And it's incredibly difficult, despite the fact that we're told that this is supposedly her record and she should have a right to it. One other term that pops up in this work that I wanted to highlight if people want to follow it down a rabbit hole as I have done is countering what we call domestic asymmetrical warfare, which I know is like, whoa, dramatic, radical word. But really all it means is there's so much power on one side of the scale with the quote system of child protective services and so little power on the other. There's lack of transparency to find out what people's rights are. Parents, families aren't always provided an attorney, but there's so many people on the child protective side. And so these imbalances of power just make people feel, outmatched from the beginning. And also the weaponization of fear of separating families is utilized. So I couldn't finish a talk like this without noting that peer supports are very helpful. We see conversations play out in our disabled parenting circles about how people have coped with both the experiences of interactions, but also the aftermath, which can stay with families for a long time. So a few takeaways that I hope you and take from our talks today is that parents with disabilities definitely have rights, but they can be difficult to know what they are. There are massive imbalances in the system that leave families at risk for separation due to biased beliefs, data, and practices. We talked a little bit about those policy changes, both myself and Dr. Lightfoot. And then the myth of benevolence is a powerful tool that is used to continue the unjust separation of families. So I can be reached a few different places, and you're welcome to follow me there. And then the QR code on the far right is my Google Scholar profile if you want to read some more of my work. I'm also happy, as Dr. Lightfoot mentioned, if you want to reach out and discuss cases and things like that. So thank you so much. I'm going to stop sharing and listen to some of the great questions we have.
Okay, we have a ton of questions. I have answered a lot of the questions that are already in the Q&A via text. And I just wanted to call out one that was related to working with parents with IDD in the NICU. This is an area that I work in as a former NICU mom with cerebral palsy who faced having my own family almost torn apart. In the NICU, we have a webinar about this on our page that you can find, and I'm happy to send a link. Other questions that we have open, if you've put a question in the chat, if you could copy and paste it into Q&A, that would be really helpful. First off, my two questions: where do we get the info on legal rights in Georgia, and do we need to have a certain official position as an advocate?
Well, I don't know Georgia specifically, but every state has a disability law center, and that might be the good place to go first to find out what the specific laws are. I'm trying to think if I know anyone in Georgia. Do you, Kara?
I don't.
Yeah, I don't know anyone in specifically, but you can also go to I think the link was put in the chat about where, and maybe you can put this in the Q&A, the National Research Center has a map that shows the laws in each state, so you can look up and see what the laws actually are in Georgia. To know about, you know, the child protection statute, that just looks specifically at TPU, to termination of parental rights. So you'd probably have to dig deeper in there, but I would go to the Disability Law Center. And no, you don't have to have a title to be an advocate. You do have a title to represent somebody in court, but you don't have a title to be an advocate, and you can go along with someone to their child protection proceedings.
Please feel free to save the chat. There's a ton of links in there, and you can save the chat by hitting the three dots on the lower right-hand side near where you would type a message. Another question, did they give her, I think meaning Lena, a specific reason for the mandated report as far as documentation as well?
Well, we're currently fighting for the documentation, but when asked that to the evaluator during the evaluation, he would say things like, "Well, you know, you clearly have a disability, and she's a busy toddler," and so there was a lot of what we would sometimes call in like researcher in my if I put on my like ableism researcher hat, we call that what's called common sense ableism, not because it is common sense, but because people accept it so easily as like, well, obviously, like you can't take care of her, that to them it seems like common sense. So it's very difficult to counter. And so that's why we kept asking. That's also why we want to access the full report. We also want to offer you know, Lena doesn't want this to happen to other people who seek out nursing care services. So we would like to offer the state Department of Nurses that included the nurse that made this report better training on, you know, on understanding disabled parents and what is and isn't appropriate for a report. And I think you're exactly right. You don't have to be an advocate to be, you know, you don't have to have a certain title. I think it is just more effective and more meaningful if you introduce I mean, your advocate could be your sister, your friend down the street, but it's just so much more meaningful if you introduce this person as an advocate to be with you at the time. It sends a little bit of a message of like, you know, hey, I have somebody here that also knows my rights, and you know, ideally they do, but I'm just saying, you know, you're playing a game with a system that's stacked against you.
This is a really great question. Are there any red flag words that mean disabled but don't outright say it?
But do you mean by the yeah, I mean, yeah, there are. I mean, I like what happens. So I've done a lot of work where we've looked at child protection records and looked at the case files, and they will say things like, you know, malingering or uninterested or lazy or those kinds of things. I don't think that's the question you're asking, though. Is it words not to use?
No, I'm guessing that she's asking because I've noticed this too. So some people are, oh, that is Lucy said, okay. Some people are kind of quote catching on to the idea that you're not allowed, or it's not, you know, it's frowned upon to directly discriminate on the basis of disability. So they'll say other things like, as you mentioned, you know, they'll say like physically, you know, it may be too physically challenging to lift the child as she gets heavier, even though the child like currently is a 6 pound infant, you know, and they're already like hypothesizing about, you know, it may be more difficult if the parent is in a wheelchair to keep up with a toddler, that kind of thing. So they're never saying like this parent is disabled and that's why I'm making this report, but they're, you know, saying everything but that.
This parent has a history of back pain.
Right.
Or
Well,
migraine.
Yeah.
Any one of those amorphous kind of things that make people think about disability who aren't familiar with disability.
And they actually do say stuff in the chat record. I mean, chat. I'm looking at the chat and calling it the
Yeah,
chat.
no.
The case files, because I really don't think people like what Dr. Ayers was saying, like common sense, like, oh, well, they have a IQ of this, therefore, you know, so there is a lot of that, and there isn't a lot, even though we have, you know, these great rulings, and I saw some in the chat, is going by really fast, but I saw some in the chat about how you know, how people don't people don't know and they don't understand. And I think that that's true. Like people just, they might, we have these laws, but it's not getting down to child protection agencies. And I do a lot of training around of child protection workers, and I don't think they're bad people. I always have to stick up for them. Like, I don't think most of them actually have gone in somehow, like they don't hate kids and families, but then the system sort of gets them this way, so
Yeah.
they, so they have these rules, they have horrible caseloads, they're given no training, they don't know, so they're just relying on whatever comes up, as their heuristic, and it makes for this horrible situation, not just for folks with disabilities, also for people, particularly people who are Indigenous and Black, who have super high rates of child welfare involvement, similar to parents with disabilities. Those are the groups we also see just get swept up into the system.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm not a lawyer, so this is not legal advice, but I would feel extremely uncomfortable giving access to medical records because I've seen so many bizarre things be used against people. Like, oh wow, your child had 3 ear infections within, a few months period. Were you not, or your toddler had bruises on their legs, which is not uncommon for toddlers learning to walk. So the opening up of medical records is something that I would be really hesitant to do.
Real quick, we have someone in the chat saying that they are a child welfare attorney who gets no training on this. Our parenting center has done legal trainings on this. I'm not sure what we have scheduled in the future, but we can also add that information to our links. How can I get judges from ordering IQ tests for parents?
I mean, I don't know. This is a question for Robin Powell, who is in
Yes.
right now.
Yes.
Some states have IQ tests in their state laws still. So changing your state law would probably be the best thing. Now, that's not very helpful. I know, very helpful of an answer, but we've got these really horrible state laws that judges are using. And that's what we have in Arizona right now. We have a bad state law, and the judges are relating to this bad state law, so it's very difficult. And I've done lots of trainings too. I just did a training last weekend up in Sedona, which was lovely, to a bunch of family law judges, and they are super passionate and don't know much about this topic. So just even the basics, like some of the stuff, some of the basic concepts are really important.
We're not going to
Yeah.
get to all the questions. If you have outstanding questions, I've put my email in the chat. Maddie can put it in the chat again, or you can email us directly at centerforparents@brandeis.edu, and I will connect you with the panelists. And I also do technical assistance myself and help where I can. I think we have time for one more. And yes, there will be an ASL recording sent out with the recording of the presentation. One of the causes of many of these issues is mandatory reporting and how little guidelines or training there are surrounding this. Is there any hope for changing mandatory reporting laws?
I don't know if there's hope, but I know that would be helpful because they are in my view, they are far too vague, and they really place people under a lot of pressure where they feel like, and I hear people, say things back to me like, well, I'm not supposed to investigate it, which you're not, but they'll say things like, if I have any concern at all, I'm supposed to call it in. That's actually not quite right, and so you really need to check your own biases. I just saw Erica put in the chat a group that I was going to recommend following Upend Project. And then I'll check out these other ones. Thanks for sharing those. But I'm also really interested in that as a lever to change.
Mm-hmm.
And these vary a lot across states too. So some, who's a mandated reporter, some are really broad and list just about everybody someone would come and counter with. So it's a huge problem.
Right. We're just about at time. I am saving the chat and it will be out. It takes a little bit of time for us to double check our captioning and process the recording, but everything will be coming out. The slides, the recording, the chat. And as we said, please feel free to reach out. And thank you, everyone, for a wonderfully engaging webinar. Take care.